on the line with us is Professor Somchai Sukapatwiwatt from, Somchai Pakapatwiwatt from the Economics Faculty of Thammasat University. Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome to the program. First of all, what is your opinion regarding the government's move to, with the executive decrees issued this week in order to transfer the huge legacy public debt to the central bank?
I would comment on two each front. The first one, I think the manner of transferring, in fact, it is not as urgent as the government has already said, because I think it is better to spend a little bit of time and giving what we call an open debate while issuing what we call the executive decree in such an urgent manner. I don't expect that this could be very urgent, so you have time in order to make it into what we call a legislative issue rather than what we call a decree. So that is the first thing. The second thing, I think that by transferring this kind of thing, you have already intervened what we call the independence of the Bank of Thailand. Because normally, when it is a public debt, it is the government that is responsible for all the debt. So by transferring to the Bank of Thailand and impose on what you have to do, I think that the government has already violated the so-called in the code of what we call independence of the Bank of Thailand.
Now, Dr. Somchai, now that you mentioned that, a lot of people don't really understand whether the government and the central bank get two separate entities, right? So can the central bank just straight up and say no to the government? Or they have to do what the government says?
Okay. If you look at two things, one is what we call the legal and the other is what we call the practical context. Normally, when we have what we call a democracy, there are two kinds of democracy. The first kind of democracy turned out to be what we call majority dictatorship. And in order to be a full-fledged what we call liberal democracy, so the democracy should not impinge upon what we call the rule of law. And secondly, you have to respect what we call the independence. So in this regard, the government, the Bank of Thailand, as an independent, as a monetary authority, can say no to the government because you have no right in order to impinge on what we call the mission of the bank. If you look at, for example, like in Germany or in EU, look at no matter what the government tries to impose on what we call the ECB, but still the ECB has the independence to say no. So they did whatever they think that is appropriate for the bank. So by impinging on the Bank of Thailand, I think that the government has already violated what we call a rule of law and also the respect of the independence of the monetary agency. So in fact, if the culture, the political culture is well entrenched in the liberal democracy, the Bank of Thailand can say no easily because that is not the responsibility of the Bank of Thailand and to take the order from the bank. So that is not doing good to the country because the image of the Bank of Thailand is an image that is counterbalance to what we call the government. So if we have a two counterbalance agency, that would be more appropriate for the governing or the governance of the country rather than impinging on the other side.
I see. Now, Dr. Somchai, do you think will the debt transfer affect the depositors, given that the Deposit Protection Agency's funds will be used to pay this huge legacy debt?
Okay, it depends rather on the commercial bank because, by impose more cost on the commercial bank. It depends on the commercial bank, what they do with what we call the high cost. So there are two possibilities. The first one is to pass the cost into the depositor. And secondly, they have to take it themselves. But I think that the second solution or the second way could be more probable because given the competitiveness and also the competition, I expect that the Bank of Thailand, the commercial bank, rather swallow the cost rather than giving to the depositor. Because in so doing, the depositor will transfer, for example, the deposit to, let's say, the state bank, which no restriction on that regard. So I expect that the Bank of Thailand will suffer more higher costs on this regard.
Now, can we go back to a little earlier, as you said that this shows that the government is intervening with an independent institution. So what sort of impact will it give?
Oh, well, it depends, but in so doing, that have already given what we call a precedent, a political precedent of what we call this government is considering the matter. So that is very important because you have this type of attitude, the attitude that is not good for what we call a full-fledged democracy, was one thing. Secondly, no matter what you have already said, you said that you have not intervened, but by in so doing, you have already done for the first time. So I expect that this would not be followed in the, for example, another example. I would expect that this time would be the last one because that would not be good for the country's democracy. So this could not be an exceptional case. By doing exceptional case in this urgency, okay, but what will happen is depend on what you follow next. But of course, the first thing is that the independence of the Bank of Thailand has already been put into doubt, at least for what we have seen this case.
I see. Right. Now, as an economic academic, what do you think the Bank of Thailand should be doing concerning this issue?
Frankly speaking, it is the government that has to decide. But anyway, since the responsibility has already been given to the Bank of Thailand, so the Bank of Thailand now have to shoulder both what we call the burden of interest and also the principal. So what the government, the Bank of Thailand, as already we have known for the news, that try to identify more sources of money in order to pay what we call the interest. And secondly, how to identify, for example, way, for example, using a profit some year to pay back the principal. But that would take at least, 2 or 3 decades. But I don't believe that 25 years that would be enough. It depends on the what we call the good luck of the Bank of Thailand. It depends on which some years you may have profit. Some years you have loss because of the intervention in order to protect, for example, the baht or something like that. So the principle, I expect that will take decades in order to be solved. But of course, the Bank of Thailand could do a little bit by shoulder the responsibility of paying, for example, responsible for the interest. But the principle is depend on what we call luck rather than the policy. Except, for example, the Bank of Thailand use somewhere that has success. For example, use 20% of the national reserve. In this regard, I personally disagree because international reserve must be protected at most rather than, for example, giving 20% in order to pay the debt for the financial institution development fund.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Somchai, for taking your time, giving us all this information and useful answers.
Okay. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Now, moving along, the CEO of